Hello, this is an interview for Cast in Stone, and my name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself, telling me your name, your profession, and mentioning any association that you have with the statue of Edward Colston that's relevant?
My name's Christine Townsend. I'm currently a Green Party councillor for Bristol, but I've been, by profession, I'm a school teacher, and I did that for over 20 years before I sort of moved into different areas of the education world. And then I'm now mostly interested in the education system in Bristol as a councillor.
Marvelous. Out of interest, what was the subject that you taught, Christine?
I did the humanities social science elements of the curriculum.
Mhm.
And I also did the personal and social health education, which is sort
Mm.
of drug and alcohol, relationships, sort of
Mhm.
finance, careers, that side of. I was a pastoral manager, pastoral leader.
Mm. So, would you please tell me, Christine, how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol? What brought it to your attention?
Um, I've kind of I'm a Bristolian, and Edward Colston has been so dominant in the city in various guises, including the statue. I'm not aware of a point in my life when I kind of went, oh, there's a statue of Edward Colston. I've kind of always known it was there.
Mm.
But I became particularly interested in it as a result of the other work I was doing, that was associated with some of the schools named after Edward Colston.
Mm.
Um, that then the people that were running those schools then started running state schools, and there
Mhm.
were rituals that they were doing on an annual basis in Bristol Cathedral that they then brought the state children, they integrated their state schools into these rituals. So that would have been in
Mhm.
2014, I think that was, that a
Mhm.
journalist got in and filmed the ceremony that was going on in Bristol Cathedral, that was
Mhm.
um, sort of propagating this idea that Colston was this great guy. Um, and my interest was from the educational perspective, because up until that point, it was Colston as an historic figure as one thing, but
Mhm.
this then became current educational and religious practices. And
Mm.
they were just lying basically to the children, um, and telling very much a slither of what it was that they wanted, that was acceptable to them for the children to know about Edward Colston.
Mhm. Could you tell me a little more about these ceremonies? You say that they changed gear in 2014 when they engaged not just private schools students, but also
No,
state school
it was
students.
before that.
Oh,
So yeah, it was
okay.
before then. So it would have been from 2008. So the organisation, the Merchant Venturers, have
Mhm.
run were running two private schools, both named after Colston, for well, the boys' school was around for centuries, and then the girls' school was opened in the late 19th century, but they were both private schools. And I didn't go to private school. I wasn't interested in the private school sector. But when I came back home to live and work and teach,
Mhm.
um, the academisation of Bristol was beginning, and this organisation, these merchant venturers, were being individuals, or the organisation itself was beginning to be the sponsors for these schools that were turning to academies.
Mhm.
And so there, and by 2014 they were running three secondary schools in the city, and a journalist got in there to film what was going on, but they would have been doing that from at least 2008, which is when they opened they took over one of the state schools and turned it into an academy.
And this ritual, how long has this ritual been going on in the private schools? And what does this ritual entail? What happens at it? What happens?
Yeah. So the children, so it's an annual, so it's called Charter Day, and it's the day that the merchant venturers, they celebrate getting their royal charter from Charles II, which I don't really know what a royal charter enables them to do, but it kind of makes them this sort of incorporated body and enables them to do certain things, and they celebrate that on an annual basis, and they change their master, and it's their sort of annual celebration, and they do that with all the children that are involved in their schools. The Bishop of Bristol on this particular day was given the sermon, so he was talking about how Edward Colston was a philanthropist, and how Edward Colston and he spoke about Edward Colston and Jesus Christ in the same sentence. And then at the end of these ceremonies, the children would give kind of say to charity. So they would all bring a coin or some money, and they would give some money to the charity, and then they would collect their Colston bun. So every child was offered this. It's a bit like a lardy cake, but not as sweet. I'd never even realised there was such a thing as a Colston bun. But apparently this is what when Colston went to his school when he was a child, apparently they used to this whether it's myth or whether it's kind of traditional rumor or whether it actually happened, but it was about you have a really big bit on the bottom and a small bit on the top, and they give it to kind of poor children, and the child can eat the bit on the top straight away. They call that bit the starver, and then you take the bigger bit on the bottom home, so that the rest of the family. But it's this kind of like, we know that you're poor, we know that you've shortage of access to food or other essential elements that keep you alive. So here you are. We're going to let you have it for nothing.
Wow.
So and the Bishop it was very much, Edward Colston was a brilliant bloke. He was a great philanthropist. He gave much to Bristol, and certainly for the private schools, it was, your school exists because this man set it up with his huge amount of wealth. But what they never spoke about was where the wealth came from, and that was the bit that kind of, it was seeing that that's what they were doing for hundreds of children, that kind of you begin to realize why it is that Edward Colston had such a hold over the city, because what it was the Church of England via Bristol Cathedral and these Merchant Venturer Society, which is hundreds of years old, and very, very powerful and long-standing institutions that are propagating this very sort of this tiny slither of what was going on and what had gone on with Edward Colston.
What role did the statue of Edward Colston play in these rituals at Bristol Cathedral?
Well, years ago, although it did this, I think we found a picture from the 1960s, possibly the 1970s. Years ago, the children would march down Corn Street, which is a very old, it's part of the older part of Bristol. They'd march from another church, which was All Saints, and they marched down Corn Street, and they would put wreaths and flowers around the bottom base of the statue.
Wow.
And then go over to the cathedral. But that did stop. They did stop doing that, but not so much that it did that, we found old images in the local newspaper, and it was very celebratory. It was a sort of Thanksgiving you know, it had that kind of religious element to it, and it was portrayed as that.
Oh, uh, what date do the images that you encountered of this wreath laying have?
Certainly into the 1970s. You could
Wow.
I mean, it may well have gone later than that.
Yes.
But certainly some of the stuff we saw was, but it would have been the private students then. It would have been the kids that went because the schools would have been private. Once the institution of the merchant venturer stepped into the state sector, it then becomes everybody's business.
But presumably those private school educated children in the 70s went on to have a very influential role in the city and maybe in the nation.
The country. Quite. And we wonder why there's such backlash about kind of talking about how people actually did make their money from certain times in the colonial period.
Now, what do you and what do others whom you're aware of feel about this statue?
Well, now what's happened to it has happened to it. I mean, I would imagine that there would, if you were to go and ask people of maybe of a certain generation or of a certain political persuasion how they felt, there may still be some people in the city that would have it go back up. But quite honestly, I think most people didn't give it a second thought really on a day-to-day basis, and probably feel that way now about the statue. I think certainly probably people of colour, if they were walking past it, that would be a very different feeling for them. But if you weren't if your life didn't really take you through and past the statue, then probably on a day-to-day basis you wouldn't, statues of dead men sort of in fancy dated clothes. That's what most statues are really. And people don't really, it's kind of, do they mean anything? I mean, they do, but do you take a notice of them on a day-to-day basis? Not really. It's kind of street stuff that's around, really. In the same way that people don't really look up at the architecture. You just kind of look at street level and go from wherever it is to wherever you're going, kind of thing, because you're getting on with your day-to-day life.
But you did look up, or you did notice the statue. So how did it make you feel when it was up?
I mean, I knew that I was aware that before we started doing the Countering Coulson awareness stuff, after this video was filmed in the cathedral, I was aware that it had been a contested statue. And that people had done interventions on it, and there had been protests, and there had been calls for removal, but also some other more truthful things to be put around and in and near that statue to give it some better sort of explanation as to who the man was or when the statue went up. I was aware that those things had happened. But as Countering Colston, we also quite deliberately stayed away from the statue because we didn't want it to just be about the statue. We knew that if we started talking about the statue, then the focus would just become purely on that. And certainly from my perspective, I was more interested in what the merchant venturers thought they were doing with their education.
Yes.
Than anything else. And also the church, I was like, what is going on in the church here that this bishop is saying there? I put a formal complaint in about the bishop to, well, it's Lancaster House. I mean, I had no idea how do you make a formal complaint about a bishop? I've got no clue. So I made a formal complaint you have to do it to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was also at the time there was quite a lot going on around bishops being exposed as having covered up sexual offences by priests. That was really bubbling up. So there was a lot of resistance by, I had to go back a couple of times to get Lancaster House to actually take it seriously about what I was trying to get. So and eventually they got an ecclesiastical lawyer to look at and report on the complaint. But it was a kind of it was a warning shot, I suppose, in many ways. It was kind of like you are not going to continue to have these sermons in this building with hundreds of children anymore. You're not this is not something that you're going to do on an annual basis, because what you're teaching these children, what you're telling these children, and really importantly, this big bun that they get at the end of it, because actually the bishop can also, old white men can say all sorts of things in really old buildings, but the children will remember they get a bun. And there's something quite, I felt it was something quite dark, that even if the kids, it's the most boring day ever, the fact that they get a cake at the end of it really would lift you if you were 12.
And even if the idea of institutional philanthropy goes over their heads, what they do remember is that they got something from
Yes, exactly.
from this man.
Yes.
So you've mentioned countering Colston. Could you tell me, how did that group start? Who was a member of it, and how did that group work? What was its working methodology?
Gosh. So after the video that this journalist managed to take was, it was in the local press, and there was a stir around it for a good few days, and the Bishop of Bristol had to kind of respond, because it was in the media, and it was the educational and the religious practice that I was really, and it kind of just, I couldn't let it go. It kind of stuck with me, and this is why I transcribed exactly what the bloke said and kind of put the complaint into Lancaster House, because I was like, I need to do something about this. I can't just go, oh well, I saw that, and I couldn't not respond. Felt like I had to do something. So, but I also then got hold of the Radical History Group, because I knew that they would also be quite interested in possibly digging a bit further into what Edward Colston did do, from the historical perspectives. And I'm not a historian, so that kind of archive work would have been, but I knew that they would, they're very enthusiastic sort of volunteer historians, and some of them are academic historians, so they know what they're doing.
Are you a member of the Bristol Radical History Group?
No, I'm not a member of them, but I've known of them for a good number of years, and they've done some really very good work about uncovering, just sort of interesting, ordinary people that are forgotten, because they don't toe the sort of establishment line about what Bristol's known as kind of being radical and sort of at the forefront, and kind of progressive, and it is, and the religious progression, the kind of things like Wesley, and the Protestant sort of groups that were quite strong in Bristol, it was okay for those things to be known about, but then there were elements of some of those religious groups that you would never know about, because the church didn't necessarily want you to know. So there's some quite strange elements to some of those religious groups. So I knew that the history group were kind of interested in as the history that wasn't told as much as the history that was. And then, and at that time, that the St Paul's Carnival was also under threat. And so Cleo Lake, who I also had come across, and Roz, who I'd also sort of known in passing and sort of in various sort of talks, and we go to the same things because Bristol's quite small, and it was just a kind of group of us, about 5 or 6, that went for a cup of coffee, and we're kind of like, we can't just not do anything about this. It's just not okay, because otherwise, unless something changes, these people will be doing this next year. Because as far as they're concerned, they've come out and said, we're all against slavery, and we think we don't like it, and we'll just carry on anyway. Because certainly in the Bristolian consciousness and the sort of the big bits of the media and the institutions, it was very much Edward Colston was a philanthropist. That's how he was described, and there was still this denial that he was he really a slave trader? What really was his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade? We're not really that sure. He used to import and export from the Mediterranean, from the near Mediterranean countries. So there was the focuses were on these other things that he did. But
Yes.
what we're not going to talk about is the fact that his family had this history of trading with Mediterranean countries. So actually, that's how they found out, because Spain and Portugal were the really early European countries involved in this. And actually, what the reality is that the Colston family wanted a piece of the money. So they kind of were looking at the Spanish and the Portuguese that were getting involved and establishing these particular routes, and saying, we want a piece of that as well because there's money in it. But the family were portrayed as being kind of wine merchants and importing cloth, which they probably did, and I'm sure they did do that. But there was also other things that the family were getting involved in, and then and Colston was one of them.
Their attention was deflected to these other areas.
Yeah. The things that are kind of palatable to the middle classes or the upper classes, or those families whose wealth can be traced back, all that sort of, because
so it's interesting that the Countering Colston was set up around a ritual that was related to the statue. You mentioned that a coffee bringing about 5 people together was where it started. Which 5 people came together, or alternatively, which 5 perspectives were brought to bear and generated the setting up of the group?
Okay, so we had myself. I brought the education element to it. Dr. Roger Bull he was from the Radical History group. Cleo Lake was an ex-Colston Girls student, but she's also mixed Afro-Caribbean Bristolian, white Bristolian heritage. Michael was a filmmaker who was also of mixed heritage. And then Katie Clark, who was an ex-Colston Girls' School. She's a white Bristolian, but she was an ex-Colston Girls' School, and her job was around, her parents are quite big environmental campaigners, and so presume that kind of campaigning change element was in her family, and she had sort of independently learnt about the reality of Edward Colston. And I think certainly at the beginning, I think she was quite torn with what it was that she was taught as a child, and what it was that she was sort of schooled into thinking, and schooled into by the institution itself and the people that educated her, and the reality that she learnt about when she was much older.
Yes.
And I think she had some conflict, whereas Cleo, because she was mixed race, she was on the receiving end of that kind of, oh, I suppose you might call it white fragility, or that as a kid at the school. So all the way through her schooling, she was she had a very different experience, we say, to Katie when she was attending Colston Girls' School.
Interesting. And interesting that you had two former pupils as part of this initial grouping. You mentioned Michael. What's Michael's surname?
I'm trying to remember what Michael's surname is. I will find out quite. It's
Is it Michael Jenkins?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and
Okay.
his is it Sense 8, I think, is the film company is his.
Mhm. And when exactly was Countering Colston set up? What year?
Oh, probably about 18 months after we first met.
Mhm.
Because at first we were kind of a bit like, well, we're just people, just doing, you know, we were like, we don't want to be a group, we don't want to, but it did get to a point where we needed to have a sort of identity, I suppose, and you know, a website, a kind of a Twitter account and an email, because people were becoming interested.
Mm. And
Yeah, and
you
that's
say
really when we kind of went, okay, let's call ourselves something. Let's establish an email address so people can contact us. Let's set up some social media elements, because that's how you communicate.
mm. So you say 18 months after you first met. I guess you first met at one of the rituals at the cathedral. Um, is that right?
Um, we would have first got together for a coffee shortly after the journalist film you
Ah,
know, was able to get the film, and
mm,
so we knew that it was another year until they would be down at the cathedral again,
mhm,
doing that ritual again. And during that time we would have met up probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, something like that, and we were all kind of, you know, finding out different bits here and there. But Ros Wilson had also had historically got involved in contesting the statue, and had
mm,
historically got involved in calling on the Colston Hall to, you know, come on, you need to change your name and you need to move away from promoting this element of Colston and kind of engaging
mhm,
with what it is that the establishment has been pushing for these 100 years and start. So there were a couple. So Ros certainly was involved in that. Roger had some understanding that these things had happened, and then Katie and Cleo were really, really powerful voices, because they were ex-students, and it's
mhm,
quite difficult for the school and other ex-students then, because the backlash from, you know, sort of middle-aged women that went to Costa, you know, that there was quite a pushback from some of those ex-students. The current ones
mhm,
were fantastically on it, which is just, well, that's what young people are, you know. They were really quite radical and really quite open, whereas those that had maybe left 20, 30, 40 years ago, who presumably at the time when, you know, they were at school, and probably shortly after, people consider themselves to be on the edge of radicalism, but they
mm.
stay there somehow. And as they age, young people overtake them, you know,
Yes.
progress, you know, and then they stay where they are, and they become kind of conservative with a small c, which is exactly what we saw with quite a large group, kind of ex-students from Colston Girls' School. But also, you know, emotionally it's really conflicting, isn't it, for them?
Mm.
You know,
Ha-
there were, yeah, lots of elements of the Bristolian population did not want to hear the reality and the truth. They very much pushed back on it.
what is that emotional conflict, in your opinion? What does it consist in?
Well, I suppose for the students, the women that would have been educated by Colston girls, um, they benefited from the fact that they went to a private girls' school, and recognizing that actually you lived a life that had some huge elements of privilege within it, and you've been successful or whatever, rather than sort of having a view of yourself that you worked really hard at school and you took advantage of opportunities and you got your head down. That's quite a different narrative to tell yourself than actually you were already halfway up the ladder by the time you went to school. It's secondary school, because you were in the private sector, and because you were already, the school that you went to was a part of an established sort of journey that young people went on, in a way that sort of kids that went to the state school down the road it doesn't exist for them, because it's part of an element of society that those kids down the road at the state school is not. They're just not they're not in a position to access, and they never will be.
Now,
and when you're told that Colston's a great bloke,
yes,
and then what's coming out is he's actually the architect of one of the darkest periods in world history. That's a lot to kind of accept and get your head around. I would, because it's so personal, because it's them, it's kind of part of their own identity. Where people go to people's school life is very, very, you never forget, do you? You never forget it. It impacts on you all the way through your life, good, bad, whatever. But
which is perhaps all the more reason why your campaign with regards to what children were being taught or how children were being lied to was so on the money, so crucial.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And it was, well, I mean, it was a realization for me that this is one of the ways in which this myth has been maintained, because by engaging children at a young age, it's grooming, really. You're grooming them into this belief system that they then, and you're preparing that younger generation to perpetuate it, and not challenge it or question.
I'm going to ask you now, Christine, about another statue in the area. So the statue of Edward Colston stood in the centre, and in front of it there is a nearby statue of Edmund Burke. What's the relationship between the statue of Edward Colston and the statue of Edmund Burke? What contestation do you remember of the statue of Edmund Burke?
I'm not particularly aware of any, to be honest. Which is, given what's happened to Colston, Edmund Burke is really he's not on the local radar, really, in terms of people asking about why that statue's still there or who that man is. I mean, the Colston statue came down because people found out what Colston was, and because there had been decades of inaction to try, despite generation after generation asking and campaigning for things to change, and they hadn't. And that just isn't the same with Burke as an individual. I would imagine, I mean, I barely know who Burke is. I mean, I know he was a MP, a local MP. That's about it, really. And that he was, at the time, he was kind of a little bit progressive in some ways, but certainly not when it came to, it was never about inclusivity or equity or anything like that. As an individual, that wasn't. It was about kind of, we a few more rich white blokes can vote, and that's about it. was his kind of approach. But
Could I?
I think I only know who that statue is of because of the hoo-ha and the noise around the statue that happened to be close to it.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Because there's another statue in Queen Square of somebody on a horse. Now, I happen to know now that it's some king with the word William. So it might be William II. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, but I'm not interested. I'm not interested in statues. It's kind of it's because they don't. It doesn't really relate to me or my life or what I don't. I see it as something that it's just cities have them, don't they? And European cities have them. But generally they're of people that died a long time ago, and they're celebrating kind of largely colonial stuff that has never been an area that I'm interested in. I'm kind of interested in the normal people and the kind of the odd crimes and the kind of the stuff that you don't get told about, how people rose up or how they pushed back, rather than the people that were the great and the good, when actually Isambard King de Brunel didn't build the bridge. He didn't. It was normal people, probably on a pittance.
Yes.
He didn't build a railway. Of course, he didn't build a. Isambard King didn't build it. He didn't. It was normal people doing probably 12 hours of hard labor every day, and they still could barely feed their children. Those are the people that built that built it, not these other people that are so say great and sort of. It's just that they were the ones that were able to access the education and the professional training in a way that just normal people couldn't.
Now, Christine, could I ask you about two other groups that have been set up in Bristol relating to the statue? What is the Legacy Steering Group, and what is the We Are Bristol History Commission? What relationship do those two groups have, and what contribution have you made to either of them?
I've not had any contribution to either. The We Are History Commission was set up by Marvin Rees. He announced it about 3 or 4 days after the statue was put in the harbour. And I mean, it was a political board, because he handpicked people that were on the board. The initial thing that they were doing was looking at what they were going to do with the statue, and so they kind of worked with the M Shed to then have it sort of preserved as it came out, and it was put in an exhibition in the M Shed. But that lasted about a year, and I couldn't tell you now what We Are History Commission are doing or what other impact they've had. I couldn't tell you. What was the other one? The Legacy Steering Group. That's also become quite political. I know Mark Steeves was kicked off of it basically by Councillor Asher Craig. But I couldn't really tell you what that was doing either. We've just had the 60 years since the Bristol bus boycott, literally this weekend, just gone. And I'm not aware that either of those groups were involved. I mean, they may have been, but I'm not aware that either of those groups were involved in any of those kind of celebrations and ceremonies and events that went on. It was Jules that I saw that was that was kind of fronting the boycott celebrations and honouring those that took part in it. I don't know.
This is interesting. Each of the We Are Bristol History Commission and the Legacy Steering Group um, engaged in consultation with the public. The We Are Bristol History Commission did a survey with the council of the local Bristol residents, or people generally, especially local Bristol residents, and the Legacy Steering Group engaged in a public consultation, which led to a report called Project Truth. What
Okay.
contribution did you make to either the survey, the council survey, or to Project Truth?
I've heard of Project Truth. But via, I think um Cleo was involved in it. Neither. I didn't get involved in either of it. I didn't go and see the thing in the M. I knew that the statue was in the M shed.
Mhm.
Um, but because it was still about the same thing. It was kind of, I
But,
don't care
but
what happens. I don't care what happens to the statue. Don't care. Let's talk. It isn't about this man. It isn't about this. It was still being centralized, and it was just like it's the young people of our city spoke. So listen
mhm,
to them. They told you what they think of this thing. They told you what they think of this myth that has been created. Um,
mm,
and but there was just still this desire to kind of centralize this figure and this what was
mhm,
this statue of this figure, and people would they personified it. They're kind of, it was I think is what's the word, anthropomorphized this
mhm,
this thing, this kind of, what was it, a piece of metal, as if it was actually a person,
mm,
which I found that sort of quite bizarre. And
mm.
actually, it's kind of, I barely looked at it when it was up. So imagine how I feel about it now it's down, really.
This is my final question
Okay.
for you, Christine. But thank you so much for your answers. They've been truly enriching. Um, If after my final question you feel that there are specific things you'd like to put on the record that my questions haven't invited you to do so, please let me know before we end, or else email them after me.
Mhm.
Email them after we finish. So my final question is this: you mentioned that the young people spoke,
Yeah.
and uh, the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol was toppled during a protest, the Black Lives Matter protest. I'm, I'm wondering about that Black Lives Matter protest. What Black voices were raised during that protest? And what Black voices have been raised during the contestation of the statue more generally? And what have those Black voices been saying? And to what extent do you think those specifically Black voices have been listened to?
Oh gosh, that's quite. So I think that the protest itself in Bristol was organised by a group of male and female they were university students, of largely of colour, from what I could kind of see. Um, I didn't go on the protest myself, um, but the people that's when you see the sort of the videos, it was very much young people of colour that were speaking on College Green, and the crowd was, I mean, it was the most mixed in terms of racial backgrounds probably that I've witnessed in Bristol. And the average age was much, much younger than most protests would be in Bristol. And it brought in a huge cross section of our, 10,000 people, was the estimate for the size of that for Bristol's protest. Huge, huge, really, for Bristol. Um, and that, as far as we know, there was no plan. I mean, they planned to walk through the centre and go out onto College Castle Park. So they were to march through, and it was a kind of semi-spontaneous event that they joined in. So I mean, the ones that brought the ropes and things, well, maybe not spontaneous, but certainly the crowds that were around the statue they knew what they were doing. It was targeted. It was, nothing else was done. There was literally no other damage on that day. And that's what I mean by they spoke. They kind of said, we've had enough. We know what this man we know what this is about, and we understand the structuralization and the historical aspects, and we understand why it is and what it is that's whilst the statue remains where it is. They kind of understood that. Immediately following, very much the mayor, because he's of Afro-Caribbean origin, he was very much the sort of international and national voice for the city. When the media just were all over Bristol for that week or so. I mean, following that, what's happened? There was some movement beforehand. I think within institutions, attempts to engage and set up spaces for people of colour specifically in institutions, and also kind of mentoring programs if needed, although I sometimes find them a bit patronizing, because it isn't, it's, they have them in political parties as well, where it's kind of, people of color need specific mentoring programs. It's kind of, they don't, we just need to recognize that the structures that benefit us as white people get in the way, and we as white people need to own that. It isn't that that the skills don't belong in those communities. Of course they do. They don't need additional stuff. We need to get rid of those barriers. Bristol University would like to promote itself as very much breaking down those barriers, but I'm not they've still got a long way to go. Certainly the education system has got a long way to go. It's gone backwards in some ways, because multi-academy trusts, somehow the structures of trusts promote and the white males, rather than kind of that inclusion element. And the teaching profession in our city, I mean, I'm just talking about the things that I know most about, really. The teaching profession in Bristol is, we had, I think we've got two head teachers of colour at the moment in the whole of the city. And given that, about our child population, our school population now is almost 25% non-white, that's really problematic for those children. And that was, that's no different to how the situation from their parents and their grandparents, really. So there seems to be some progress, and then there's some backtrack. It kind of goes backwards. It's not linear, I think, is what I'm trying to say. That it's an ongoing process, and each generation sort of almost has to go through the same battles in some ways. I got no idea whether I answered your question or not, really. Sorry.
I think you did. Councillor Christine Townsend, thank you very much for sharing with me your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a while since we spoke about the statue.
It's been a real delight to share conversation with you. Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording now.